Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'll just turn my volume down a bit. Welcome to today's CPD session, which has been presented by Kate Russell. Kate is an agricultural valuer and chartered surveyor with 30 years experience in rural land and property. Kate set up Tellus Natural Capital as an independent consultancy to advise on the new and emerging markets for natural capital, including carbon, biodiversity, and natural flood management. And Kate will now run through various topics in that sector. So I shall now pass you over to Kate. Kate, thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry I can't see you, but I'm assured that you're there, and the numbers coming in through the door keep popping up. So great to be here, and I'm just going to have a little trot today through natural capital markets. Now, we've got a little poll for you that you should see in the polls section on your page now. How much do you think you know about natural capital? Is it A, nothing, I'm just here for the CPD, B, I know a little bit, but I'm here to learn more, or C, your clients are starting to ask questions about things like carbon credits or biodiversity net gain or anything else in the realm of natural capital. So we'll leave that poll running for a little bit and we'll come back to it in a moment. So this is really what I'm intending to cover over the next sort of half an hour to 40 minutes or so, and then we'll leave time for questions at the end. I'm going to explain a little bit about what I mean by natural capital, what's happening with that, what's driving the markets, the very important principle of additionality, which is a sort of technical point, but an important one to understand. And then really to focus mostly on where these emerging opportunities are, what are the markets that are starting to emerge, and how might we be able to monetize those, and then a little bit about risks and next steps for you and for your clients. So we will kick off on that, and if you have just joined while I've been doing this rambling introduction, please do have a look at the poll and pop your answer in as you're going, and we will keep that poll running as we go through the presentation and pick it up a little bit later on. So what is natural capital then? Well, you'll be familiar with the concept of the other capitals like social capital and financial capital, and natural capital is really what the planet and the environment offer us that we then use in society. And when you drill it down to its absolute core basics, we're looking at those items across the bottom of the slide there. So soil and geology beneath the soil, because that is all factored in together, water, the air around us, and then all the biodiversity that those three things support. So that is our natural capital. And as a society over the past couple of 100 years, we've drawn down on that natural capital and we haven't been replenishing it as much as we should have done. So we need to try and find ways that we as society and as businesses and as consumers can start reinvesting in that natural capital. Otherwise, to keep the analogy of a bank account going, we're going to run out of funds. And we can't go overdrawn because we only have the one planet. So those core items of natural capital then create these things that get called ecosystem services, which is all the stuff that's delivered by nature, by soil, by water, by air, and through our biodiversity. And it's things like the sequestration of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that happens with every little bit of vegetation that you can see out of your office window at the moment. It's things like the support for health and well-being that a lot of us really started to appreciate very much during the COVID lockdown, for example. It's things like mitigating flood risk by the soil being able to absorb more water and taking steps to reduce water runoff and water erosion. So all of these ecosystem services are being delivered all the time by our natural capital, and there are ways that we can enhance that and support it and proactively seek to grow those ecosystem services. But the problem with the system that we have is that the markets that we have at the moment don't recognise and reward all of those ecosystem services that we'd like to see more of. We have private markets which work for some private goods. So food is a good example. You know, you go out and you pay for the meat, you pay for the vegetables, you pay for the wheat and the barley in your bread and your beer. And that is something that's very directly paid for. We pay for energy quite directly, produced from timber, produced from wind, and so on. We pay for fibre, construction materials, lots of other things that we do pay for that are produced from natural capital. But there's a whole heap of stuff that we don't pay for or haven't been paying for so far. They're just delivered as free riders on the back of other activities on land. So we've been growing woods for timber, for construction materials and wood fuel, but those woods are also capturing carbon and enhancing biodiversity. So how are they the ways, you know, what ways might there be that we could create markets where we start to monetize those ecosystem services and make them more attractive for land managers to deliver? And therefore we can get more benefit because we start to enhance our natural capital, we start growing and replenishing that natural capital base. So what is driving these markets at the moment? Well, it's quite interesting when you start delving into this. Clearly, the corporate world is forging ahead, and really, you know, it's not waiting for government to make all the moves here. We've seen organisations like Morrison's set their own net zero targets. They're very actively working in their supply chain to secure supplies of net zero beef, for example. The dairy companies are well onto this. So Arla has a sustainability agenda. But lots of other corporate businesses are now starting to think about how they're going to reach net zero themselves and what those obligations will mean. Part of what's behind that for the bigger corporate businesses and the financial institutions is the regulations on climate-related financial disclosure and nature-related financial disclosure. So we've got the task forces for both those, the TCFD and the most recently announced TNFD. That's going to drive financial institutions and big businesses to start having to report on their impact on nature as well as their impact on climate. And bringing those two together is really important because we're not going to solve the climate crisis without thinking about nature, and we're not going to be able to restore nature without taking account of the impact of climate change. So the two of them are very much part of the same issue and increasingly recognised as such. So trying to steer people away from too much carbon tunnel vision. So those requirements for financial reporting are going to start driving change within the big corporate sector and the financial sector to start scrutinising their own impacts and then trying to mitigate those impacts and compensate for them. So there are opportunities that are going to be happening over the next sort of medium term arising from that. And sort of alongside of that, but perhaps to a degree independent from it, is the whole ESG agenda. So the environmental, social and governance agenda, again, driven by big corporates, thinking about their stakeholders, thinking about their shareholders in particular, but also consumers, demanding increasingly that businesses do the right thing and are treating the environment the right way and considering climate change in what they do. So that's a driver as well. And then finally, the loss of farming subsidies is a big driver from the other side, from the landowner and farmer side, trying to understand how they could replace that lost income and find other income streams to support them. How do we know what we're doing? So there's a lot of concern about greenwashing, and you'll have seen that yourselves in press reports and things. So assurance and standards is going to be an important part of these markets. And we have a few standards already on the market now. So for the carbon codes, the woodland carbon code, the peatland code are recognised and formal standards. We've got a biodiversity metric for biodiversity gain, and new standards are sort of being discussed and created all the time. But standards globally are an issue. People having confidence in what they're buying is an issue. And so high integrity is another catchphrase that's really starting to be associated with these. And this gives the UK market an advantage with UK purchasers, because we will be able to say, well, if you are a UK business, you want to invest in nature, do it in the UK, you can then literally come and see it. You can talk to the people delivering it. You're not buying some project to prevent rainforest destruction in the Amazon, which you're never going to be able to see, and you're going to have to rely on other people telling you that it's genuinely happening. So standards are a bit of an issue. Spatial planning is one of the factors that will be driving the biodiversity market. We are just on the point of starting to get local nature recovery strategies being developed right across England. So this is England only. They're going to be like a local plan for nature at a county level, identifying areas where biodiversity is already important, so nature reserves and sites of special scientific interest, and identifying other areas where biodiversity could be really important to buffer those sites or to connect habitats and to create this network of better and more joined up biodiversity sites. So this is likely to become quite an important decision-making tool for local authorities when they're looking for where biodiversity gain sites should be located. And it will also start driving decisions in the private sector about land use. So it's one to keep a bit of an eye on in your local area. These will all be going out for consultation in a similar way to your local plan. Just briefly to touch on this principle of additionality, because it will come up as I go through the different kinds of market that are emerging. If we're talking about creating a credit, like a carbon credit, that's going to be used in a formal offset market, so I am generating a carbon footprint, I want to go and buy a carbon credit so that I offset that against my carbon output, then I must be able to be sure that that carbon credit is additional to anything that would have been going on anyway. It can only be happening because of the money I've paid for that carbon credit. So my money buying the carbon credit has enabled the tree planting to happen, for example. Because if that tree planting was going to happen anyway, then that carbon dioxide would have been sucked out of the atmosphere by those trees, and me buying a credit makes no difference one way or the other. So this concept of additionality is really important, but it does create difficulties, because then you get the conundrum of how to reward good practice that's been going on for years. So landowners that have been planting woodlands for a long time, how do we reward them for the carbon dioxide they're sequestering? Does additionality in fact reward the people that have been doing the wrong thing in the past? And how do we actually secure value for money in getting the land use change that we need? So these are sort of issues that are holding back people from making an investment in this space at the moment. But let's move to the actual markets that are starting to emerge. And just as a quick reminder, if you joined before I started talking about the poll, you might be able to see the poll on your page. And if you haven't answered that question already, and only about half of you had, do have a look and just tell me whether what your existing understanding was, and we can talk about that a bit later. So the emerging markets that I see, and I am fully engaged in this as pretty much my full-time job. So I'm going to go through these in the order that I see of them being most real in terms of them delivering transactions in a marketplace that you can actually start putting a price onto. And the first one of those is water quality through the nutrient neutrality issues. And if you are involved in the built environment anywhere around the coast of England at the moment, the chances are you will have come across nutrient neutrality, because there are now 74 local planning authorities affected by the requirement to prevent any more damage to protected catchments, which are mostly coastal. So we range from the Solent, huge catchment all along the south coast, right through the Somerset Levels and up through Herefordshire. We go up to the Eden catchment in Cumbria, and some of the lakes as well are affected. And then hopping across to the east coast, the Tees catchment is affected, and then one or two down around Norfolk and into Stodmarsh in Kent. So wherever you are, if you're close to the coast in England, you may well find that development is being subject to nutrient neutrality provisions. This is all because of, I won't go into all the background, but it's all because of the fact that these water bodies like the Solent catchment are protected, highly designated, and are suffering from nutrient pollution. That nutrient pollution is coming from a number of sources, including our wastewater, sewage treatment plants, and also agricultural runoff. But what is happening in it at the moment is that developers who want to add development with overnight accommodation in an area affected by nutrient neutrality have to demonstrate that that development is neutral for nutrients. So either they're installing treatment plants on site to say, okay, I'm going to build 50 houses, but I'm going to have a wastewater treatment plant to deliver all of that on site, so my water is completely clean. Or if I'm going to build 50 houses and I can't do anything about it on site, I need to pay someone else in the same catchment to reduce the amount of nutrient they're putting into the catchment. And we are seeing these agreements come together. We are seeing trades happen. We're seeing developers buy land use change. So they will pay a farmer or a landowner to take land out of agriculture and put it into woodland, or to install a constructed wetland, which will absorb nutrients out of the water and deliver that land use change. It's a very long-term project. The kind of change to take nitrates and phosphates out of water takes 80 to 100 years or longer, and it's got to be in the same catchment. So it's a complex situation. Technically, it's not very easy to do. There's a lot of uncertainty around it. Natural England are in there having to oversee everything, and that slows the whole thing down. But nevertheless, trades are happening. Trades have been happening for about 3 years now in the Solent and are starting to happen in places like the Tees. So we're seeing transactions happen that are delivering land use change on the ground. The developers have no options about this. If they're in an area where this is happening, they have no option other than to buy. So it's a regulated market, which is forcing change to happen. The next market that's starting to emerge is biodiversity net gain. And this will be a statutory market from January next year. So all new development, pretty much all new development, which requires planning consent from January next year, will have to demonstrate that it's delivering 10% more biodiversity than is being damaged by the development. So big challenge. Lots of detail is still missing, and we're expecting a whole tranche of announcements in November with detailed guidance and the regulations and the start of more of the mechanics of this. But if you're a developer and you want to build a distribution warehouse, a housing estate, commercial property, infrastructure, you are going to need to have a baseline score of what your site is worth now, and then an assessment of how much biodiversity will be on the site when the development is completed. If you can't deliver a 10% gain, then you will be able to go off-site and either deliver off-site through a deal or go and buy biodiversity units off-site from a third party. So an emerging market is starting to develop around this. As a last resort, you'll be able to buy statutory credits from the government. Now, we haven't got time to go into BNG in detail. That could be the subject of a whole hour, or in fact, indeed, probably a whole day's worth of advice and support. And of course, if any of you do want to know more, my contact details will be on the last slide and you will get a copy of those. So please do reach out and contact me if you do want to know more about BNG in particular, with it coming up in January. I have been doing some in-house training for people on this and will be happy to help. You will need an ecologist to be involved. You'll need to be able to measure your biodiversity, which is actually measuring your habitat, type, extent, and condition. Just be aware that some brownfield habitats, some of the things that emerge on brownfield sites over a period of years, are regarded as being highly valuable. So where you think you might have a brownfield site and it's fairly basic looking to the untrained eye, you do need to get an ecologist to have a look at it. You may find that you've got one of these quite unusual, rare habitats that's appearing through the concrete, and you could find that to be a nasty shock. So if you're thinking about development sites, it's quite a good idea now to get a biodiversity metric assessment done by an ecologist that understands how to do those assessments. That's not me, by the way. I'm not pushing to do that work. I am not a trained ecologist, but to get one of those base level assessments done quite early on, so you understand what you're dealing with, they're not terribly expensive at that stage compared to what you might find if it's a nasty shock later. Biodiversity net gain, if you go and buy your units from a third party, or if you deliver it on site as part of the development, has to be maintained for at least 30 years. And it all has to be secured through a Section 106 agreement, or in due course through potentially a conservation covenant, which is a new tool that's been designed specifically for this purpose. The thing about BNG is that I think a lot of developers, most of the developers I've spoken to so far, be they house builders, be they big shed people, be they commercial developers, they will be looking to try and put as much of this on site as part of the development as they can. And they're being incentivized to do that by policy, to stack on top of their existing planning requirements for green open space, to stack it with their sustainable drainage systems. You're going to have an attenuation pond. Can you do a bit of planting around that pond? And that will count towards your biodiversity as well as your sustainable drainage. So we'll see developers, I think, getting really creative with how they deliver that on site. With infrastructure, I think infrastructure is naturally going to try and seek to secure what it needs through CPO powers if necessary. It's untested at the moment, and of course those powers weren't really designed and written with this in mind, but nevertheless I suspect that a lot of infrastructure schemes will try and use compulsory purchase to deliver it. So there's a question there then for the private sector, the kind of farmers and landowners that I'm advising, as to how much demand there's going to be for off-site habitat banks. But I think there's a lot of scope, if you're involved in the development space, to think really early, how are we going to achieve our biodiversity net gain with this development? And if we can't deliver it on site, let's start thinking early about who we need to speak to get some other land that we can secure that gain on. And ideally that other land needs to be in the same local planning authority area, but it doesn't have to be, it can be further away. You might have to pay more for it if it's further away, but it still might be the best solution. And I think there are creative things that can be done as well with looking at biodiversity net gain and also nutrient neutrality, which can be stacked on top on the same land. So if, for example, you're a house builder and you've got a need to deliver nutrient gain and biodiversity gain, and you can work with a local landowner to deliver a lovely little, essentially private nature reserve, you could badge that. You get some marketing and PR feedback on it. It delivers you multiple benefits and can deliver you a nice PR story as well. So there's scope to be quite creative, I think, about how some of this is delivered and to come up with good solutions that give clients multiple benefits. The statutory credit scheme is intended to be last resort, but just to look at prices on this, it gives us a bit of a clue. These were indicative prices published in July, so they're not the actual definitive prices yet. This is DEFRA testing the water. And for every different kind of habitat, they've set a different kind of price. So if you've got a medium grassland, which would be the normal kind of habitat that gets destroyed by a lot of development, the price per biodiversity unit damaged will be £42,000 if you need to buy it from the statutory scheme as a last resort. So the private habitat bank market is going to have to be priced more competitively than that, but still to cover the costs of managing all of that over 30 years and the monitoring, verification, and all the other baggage that comes with it, plus the cost of doing your Section 106s and all those other things. So we don't really know where prices will go at the moment. There's a lot of talk about prices being, £25,000 to £30,000 per unit. But as you can see, they could vary a lot. And who will buy statutory credits? Well, we wait to see. Probably the people that only need a small amount of top up to get them over the line, or they need a particularly unusual habitat type in order to be able to complete their project. So there's a link there to the published data. And again, I can talk more about this if anybody's got questions. If you have questions, do put them in the chat as we go through, and we'll pick them up at the end. So the third market sector is carbon. And the reason that this only comes third on the list is that this is a voluntary market. It's nascent, it's been around for a while, but in the UK at the moment, unless you're a big high energy user in the emissions trading scheme, if you're not in that emissions trading scheme, you don't have any obligation to get involved in offsetting carbon. So those businesses that want to offset their carbon at the moment are doing it voluntarily. And so it's a discretionary spend, and therefore that's capping what people are prepared to pay. On the other hand, land managers who are putting woodland into these schemes or peatland restoration projects, they have quite a lot of cost involved in that. It's a very long-term commitment. And at the moment, the carbon prices being offered are simply not high enough to make it very attractive. However, there are other opportunities, and I've spoken to clients, worked with clients who have multiple businesses. They might own some rural land, but they also, for example, have an interest in a haulage business. And in order to be able to secure local authority contracts for their haulage business, they want to be able to demonstrate that they are offsetting some of their carbon and looking to do that by planting trees on their own land. So there are clever ways to sort of join bits of this puzzle together for some businesses who have multiple interests. But at the moment, the carbon market is a tricky one, and we see demand and supply both being quite weak. However, there are lots of new ideas. A carbon code for hedges is about to be produced, and I think that could be quite popular for the voluntary market, for people interested in ESG type work. There's also codes now bringing carbon and biodiversity together as an environmental credit that again might suit those corporates that want to start investing in nature and climate, and do that voluntarily to satisfy stakeholders. Moving on then, natural flood management. I'm seeing an increasing amount of interest in this just over the last 6 to 12 months. There are lots of ways in which the flow of water off land can be slowed down. And since Victorian times, we've been very good about speeding up and getting water off the land, canalising our streams, removing barriers and things like that. And actually now we're starting to think that we've taken a wrong turn with that approach. And what we need to do is to start to slow the flow of water down, to store it higher up in the catchments, make the hills wetter, store the water in the peat or in the soil, improve infiltration through soils, reconnect floodplains, stop building on floodplains, reconnect them to the rivers and allow the rivers to flood where they should in order to reduce flood risk on the built environment downstream. So the Environment Agency is very heavily involved in projects right across England at the moment, looking at ways that natural flood management could be integrated into their schemes. And the interest here is about who should pay for that. So who stands to lose if a town floods, and how could they be persuaded to pay a little today to reduce the risk of having to pay a lot as a result of flooding tomorrow? So there are some really novel schemes putting packages together, and there's one in the Wyre catchment in Lancashire where the buyers include the Environment Agency, local authorities and statutory undertakers, so electricity DNOs who might be affected if substations are flooded, for example, are starting to buy the rights from farmers to change land use in order to reduce flood risk lower downstream. So it's a really interesting policy area. The challenge remains in how to get the money to the people who are delivering that product on the ground over a long enough timescale to make a difference. But I think we'll see a lot more of this in future. Green prescribing, again, another really interesting growing market. And as I said at the introduction, during lockdown, people realized how important access to green space was and how important it was to be able to get out for your daily breath of fresh air. NHS England has recently done a 2-year study looking at the potential for green prescribing, so to actually engage people in active recreation out of doors, or to engage in therapeutic activity out of doors that helps mental health and well-being. At the moment, a lot of this is community scale projects. It's about supporting people with mental health issues in community gardening, for example, or it's about supporting active travel, guided walks for people that don't have confidence to go out on their own, guided cycling, that kind of thing. But when you start to look at the figures behind this, it can become really interesting. So I've just put a stat in there that the overall cost to the economy of physical inactivity in England alone was estimated at £8.2 billion per year. I think that report was 2020 or 2021. And the reason that rang a bell with me was because I'd also been looking at another report the same week that said that the total amount of money that we spent on our agri-environment schemes for farmers, so trying to persuade farmers to do more environmentally friendly works on their farms, over a 30-year period was 8.4 billion. So we spent almost the same amount of money, but over 30 years trying to improve the environment. But the cost of physical inactivity to the NHS is estimated at 8.2 billion per year, or not just the NHS, but society generally. So if we could get a little bit of that money coming out and supporting people to be more active and more engaged with nature and the environment, we could reduce the cost to society and create income streams for farmers and landowners as well. So this is a really interesting area, but at the moment it's quite small scale, but I think it will grow. And then perhaps the last one on my list at the moment is climate and air quality regulation. Again, it sounds a bit odd, but if you're in an office now or working at home and you can look out of a window and see any kind of vegetation, a tree with leaves on it, a shrub, anything at all, the leaves on that plant are acting as little air filters the whole time, and they can filter particulates out of the air. They can also provide shading and cooling benefits. But all of those trees and vegetation that grow alongside our roads and our streets and in our towns are doing a huge amount of good for society by clearing up those particulates. We don't have any value. We don't ascribe a value to that. There are tools that will enable you to put a value to it, but nobody pays the money for that benefit. So might it be that in future, as part of your planning to get new infrastructure or to get new distribution warehouses, for example, you're going to have to put a green lung into that development to help mitigate the impact of the particulates in the atmosphere. It's not there yet, but I think there's such a high interest now in air quality, as we've seen with the emission zones being introduced into a lot of cities. This is another way to tackle it, by using nature and letting nature do what it can do. So it'll be interesting to see whether that develops as well. Now, as I slightly alluded to earlier on, these benefits don't stand in isolation. If you plant some trees on some land, you're delivering multiple benefits: biodiversity, carbon storage. You might be delivering cooling on air filtration as well. There are lots of ways that these multiple benefits arise from these changes in land use. The challenge then is, how could you sell those multiple benefits, and could you sell them to multiple different buyers with different timelines on different contracts, or will the additionality rules stymie your efforts to do that? And I think it's very difficult at the moment, with the way things are, to sell them to different buyers. But where I can see an opportunity is to say to a big corporate buyer who's interested in investing in nature and wants to get some climate benefits, to say, well, here's a bundle of benefits for you. If you invest in this project to enhance nature in this place, you'll be getting biodiversity benefits, you'll be able to claim some carbon credits, and you're also going to be delivering some reduced flood risk downstream. And you need to pay for all of that benefit if you want to buy this environmental credit that we are trying to sell. So I was in a meeting yesterday up in Yorkshire, looking at a project there that will deliver biodiversity. It will deliver some carbon storage. It may have flood mitigation benefit, but we're not entirely sure yet. We need to do more work to establish the data for that. It will deliver air filtration, but it's way up in the Dales in Yorkshire, away from the people who would benefit from it. So the air filtration market will be low. It might deliver some clean water benefits. So who as a buyer, as a corporate, might be interested in the package that we are looking to put together, and how much would they be willing to pay for that? But all of this comes with a lot of caveats. This is a very new and emerging market area, so we have to be quite cautious. I don't know how good my Latin is, but I think it might be caveat venditor rather than the usual. So these emerging markets, they're often relying on long-term land use change. And there are concerns around tax reliefs with that, because agricultural land use benefits from tax reliefs that are not available elsewhere. So if you're moving away from agriculture into a different land use, some of your tax might be at risk. They're very long term, so they're going to be binding more than one generation of landowner to deliver. So you need to be thinking about very long-term consequences, and in effect, permanent land use change in a lot of cases. The idea is that they will create income streams or add value to the farmers and landowners delivering them, but there could also be impacts on the capital or rental value of that land, because you're changing the land use and you're locking it up in a long-term contract effectively. If there are impacts on the capital or rental value, you might also need to be considering any structured borrowings that are secured on that land, because it could affect the value of the security. We also need to be very careful to think that you don't just sell off the family silver. So when I'm talking to farmer and landowner clients, I'm saying to them, what is it you're likely to need yourselves? What is your own supply chain going to need? Are you looking ahead to think about doing development on your own land? And if so, what will you need to enable that development? Don't go just selling off to the highest bidder on day one. And if you're coming at it from the other side with clients who might be wanting to buy these services, you need to be thinking about who you want to partner with, who's credible, who's going to deliver a high integrity product. It's not going to leave you at risk of greenwashing. So what should clients be doing now, whether they are clients in the built environment sector or the rural environment sector or infrastructure or any of those other sectors? I think really it's just a question at the moment of starting to get an eye over this landscape, starting to understand it. And of course you're here, which is probably a good time to just pop back to the poll. I said, how much do you think you know about natural capital? 5 people are just here for the CPD. So that's absolutely fine. I completely understand your position. You've got a good bit of time before the end of December, but you'll rack up another hour today. 9 people said they know a little bit, but they're here to learn more. So that's great. That's the sort of expected point on the Venn diagram. And good to hear that a couple of you have already got clients who are starting to ask you questions about this. So I think we can see that, this is coming. And what you are doing now in taking some first steps is understanding enough to be able to respond when clients say, is this something I should be getting involved with? So helping them to understand their own position is obviously the starting point. What is it that they need? Are they starting to do carbon audits in their business? I'm starting to get approached by clients to say, my bank wants to know what I'm doing about sustainability in the business. My bank wants me to start thinking about this. Should I be getting a carbon audit and understanding my scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? If that then leads me to the question of how do I want to go about mitigating my carbon footprint? Do I need to be thinking about nature alongside the carbon and not just getting this carbon tunnel vision that I warned against earlier on? Might it be the supply chain that is driving this, or might it be the regulator? So if you've got clients who are involved in development, then the regulation side of it in terms of things like nutrient neutrality might be driving their activities. So understanding what they need and helping them to get the advice to really understand their own position is the first step. And then thinking about those opportunity areas. Is it that your client might need to be either buying or potentially selling ecosystem services? Might they have an agenda that they want to promote themselves in the locality as being environmentally responsible, builders, businesses, occupiers of property, investors in the local community? And how could they help themselves to do that by investing in a high quality nature project that is going to restore the local environment, maybe create a nature reserve that local communities can access, or it's something related to their core business. We had some conversations yesterday about if we're restoring biodiversity in this project in Yorkshire, there's a particular flower that is symbolic of these pastures that we want to restore. What companies have got that colour in their logo, or that flower in their logo even? You know, could we reach out to them and say, are you interested in investing in nature? And if so, would you like to come and look at our project? Because it might just fit with your corporate image or your objectives as a business. Future development, I think, is really a good place to start. What is your client looking at doing in the short, medium and long term? And how is that going to impact on nature and climate? And what will they need to be thinking about in order to mitigate that, offset it, or start to address it? And if they can start looking quite far ahead, they may be able to save themselves quite a bit of cost. Perhaps they can acquire land to deliver biodiversity net gain themselves, rather than having to go and buy units from a third party and be subject to the market for those. Perhaps they might be able to use some land that doesn't have any other value to deliver their biodiversity offsets. So I spoke to one substantial landowner who said, well, we've got some development land, but we've also got a former landfill site. Can't build on the landfill site, but we certainly could enhance the biodiversity of it. So why don't we use that to deliver our biodiversity net gain and use that as our own net gain site that then unlocks a wider development portfolio for us? So as I said earlier on, there are ways to be sort of smart and strategic about this. And then who might you want to work with? Well, me, obviously, but apart from me, you might want to, your clients might want to align themselves with a conservation charity that has a good profile locally and has a good reputation for delivering nice outcomes. They might want to partner up with a local landowner who can deliver woodland benefits, for example. You might want to look at strategic development opportunities and work with developers and others, and start to build local networks of community that might want to be involved in these things. And again, this is something we touched on yesterday in this meeting in Yorkshire. How can we start to draw a community of interest together around our project who would have interest in and connections with what we're trying to do? So lots of challenges remain. The goalposts have been shifting a bit recently on policy. You'll have been aware of the current government starting to withdraw a little bit from its environmental commitments, which is a bit of a concern as far as I'm concerned. We will wait and see, because we are likely to get a new government next year. And we do need to try and have some long-term commitment to this, because these are not short-term issues. There's a whole load of challenges around how you measure and verify what's being delivered, so you can be assured that this is not greenwashing, that you are getting the environmental change that you've paid for, and that you've got real value out of it. And valuation and setting a price, I've not touched on that at all in this presentation, because it's a very difficult and complicated subject at the moment. How are we going to set prices for this? There's an awful lot of cost involved. There's a lot of long-term commitment. But at the moment, we need to persuade the corporate investors that this is worth their while. And actually, back to my opening statements, we're not making any more natural capital. We have to reinvest in what we've got and try and make up some of the damage that we as society have been carrying out on our natural environment for sort of the last 200 years. So that's going to take time and effort. It's quite difficult to bring all of these into a coherent structure, lots of different ambitions and agendas and timescales involved. So that's quite a challenge for those of us trying to pull these deals together. We need to think about supply chains. We need to think about scale. I get fund managers on the phone saying, yeah, Kate, we want to invest and we've got 200 million to spend, and what can you do for us? You're like, well, I could do an awful lot with 200 million. But in terms of England and what we're doing, the scale of these projects is much smaller and more local. So how do we scale that up and make it investable? And then you've got things like landlord-tenant relations, the real sort of practical stuff. How do we get everybody involved? And where you've got let land, how do we reward tenants as well as landlords for their involvement in this? So I put a few questions out there. How can you protect yourself against greenwashing? Should we be focusing UK or global? And I've talked mostly about England today because the biodiversity net gain statute is only England. Wales and Scotland are doing their own thing. Carbon markets are UK, but as I said, not very exciting. Nutrient neutrality, again, is England only, but some Welsh catchments are affected as well. But I think we will see more of this growing across the UK as a whole. And, you know, there are big sort of questions that I'm trying to tackle about the balance between public and private investment for climate and nature, which you might not want to get into today. You might want to ask me something very much more specific about a question your client has put to you, or about carbon, or about biodiversity, or indeed about water. So at that point, with about a quarter of an hour left, I'm very happy to take questions. My contact details are on there. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find Tellus Natural Capital on LinkedIn, and you can find me on Twitter, Kate Ag Valuer, and you can find Tellus NatCap on Twitter as well. Thank you very much. So Andrew, I think we've got some questions.
Have we? Yes, we've got a Q&A section now. So if anybody wants to ask any questions, then if you just click on the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen and just type your question in, and they'll pop up for Kate to respond to. So I'll just very quickly say thank you very much for the presentation, Kate. I thought really informative, and obviously a very sort of hot and relevant topic at the moment. One that, I mean, from our point of view, we're trying to get our head around it, to understand it, and how it affects what we do and the advice that we give. We certainly had in our neck of the woods, we're on the south coast of England, a number of developments that have been thwarted whilst they sort out whatever the solution is to the nutrient neutrality issue, particularly around the solent. And it's not something we've got involved with directly, but our role as agents on those schemes has been frustrated by the fact that we've not been able to get planning consent.
Yep.
So yeah, that's been a very expensive situation for the clients involved in those particular projects. I had a few questions just to sort of kick things off on the question front. So I'll just reel these off and then leave them to you to answer all in one go, if that's okay.
Okay.
So firstly, a question about how much agricultural land is being used for BNG offset, or for non-agricultural uses to facilitate the BNG offset. How much land is forecast, if there is a forecast as to how much land could be used for BNG offset. How land might be allocated for it. So if we've got clients that own land that they want to put forward for this sort of thing, because I imagine that if you can get your land allocated, then it might be more lucrative than growing crops or feeding animals. And how, if there's any evidence yet as to whether allocating your land for BNG offset affects the value of the land. So yeah, if I can throw all of those over to you.
Great. Okay. Well, we could do a whole other hour on those questions, Andrew, but I'll try and answer them very briefly. The developers that I've spoken to so far are seeking to deliver as much of the biodiversity net gain on site as part of the development as they possibly can, because that way they've got control over the cost and they've got control over the timescale. So there was a report done in 2021 So a little time ago, and before the statutory intervention has started, so we still haven't got the real market happening, although we've got some pilots and trials have been done. This report in 2021 estimated that the total demand for biodiversity units offsite would equate, depending on how many units you can stack per hectare, which depends very much on what kind of habitat you're looking at. But ballpark, it came down to something like between 9 and 20 hectares per local planning authority per year. That's one BNG habitat bank, because to be able to justify the overheads in a habitat bank, including the cost of all your legals and your maintenance and your verification, your monitoring, you're probably going to want a habitat bank of about 20 hectares. So I've been advising clients, I've done feasibility studies for a number of clients now, looking at habitat bank opportunities, and the demand for those units is the biggest risk. So if you have a developer who is almost like an anchor tenant, who says, yes, I'm going to need 10 units over the next couple of years, I will commit to buy them off you, so I'll basically take an option to take them from your habitat bank, then great. Then you've got an anchor tenant and you can start. If you want to do it speculatively, I think there's quite a high degree of risk, not least because you don't know how many other people are trying to do habitat banks in the same planning authority area. So is there an allocation mechanism? Not yet, but a number of planning authorities are looking at how they can start connecting so that there's a pipeline of habitat banks ready for developers. So a number of local planning authorities are starting to look at that space now, but a number of the wildlife charities are quite into this space. So the wildlife trusts and people like Trust for Oxfordshire's environment in my area here in Oxfordshire are working to be that sort of middle point where they can help match developers with sites. So there's an awful lot of activity happening here, but it's still a great amount of uncertainty. What would it do to the value? Well, that's like saying, I've got some land with potential for another use, but I haven't got any planning on it yet. So how are you going to value that? Similar to that, really, unless you've actually got a commitment with a signed deal and a contract to purchase units, all you've got is potential. And so as a valuer, I think you have to be really cautious about this. And I am not a registered valuer, so I haven't done a valuation for a long time, but I have looked at one or two valuations recently, and yeah, there's a lot of questions to be asked about how certain are you of the income stream. I'll move on to Simon's question because it's related. Hi Kate, on BNG, does this mean no development can happen without an agreed BNG credit being documented, and who regulates it? So the mechanism, Simon, in the Environment Act is that planning permission won't be granted unless you fulfill the planning condition of submitting a biodiversity gain, biodiversity gain plan with the planning application. That biodiversity gain plan will have to address how the development is going to deliver its 10% net gain. Will that be on site? Will that be by the developer delivering it on some land next door that they're renting for the purpose or they've bought for the purpose? Or will it be by the developer buying units from elsewhere? And if it's buying units from elsewhere, they need to be able to say where they're going to buy them from. So who regulates it? The local planning authority. At the moment, it's going to be through the planning condition, which is the mechanism in the Environment Act, and then through a Section 106 agreement, although conservation covenants were designed for this purpose, but we've not really got them fully effective yet. Are there sufficient trained ecologists for the market? No. No, there aren't. Ecologists are like hen's teeth now. So if you find a good one, hang on to them. And if this is Simon Adams from Kendal, there are some great people in South Cumbria that I can put you in touch with if you would like to know. Edward, do you envisage nutrient neutrality will be expanded to further catchments? Ooh, good question. Because initially there was one round of notifications by Natural England, and then in March 2022 they announced a new round overnight, no warning whatsoever. which took it from about 35 or maybe even fewer local planning authorities affected up to 74, and brought in entire new catchments overnight with no warning. So could it be expanded further? It could well be. But given all that's just been happening around the Michael Gove attempt to use the Levelling Up Bill to change the direction of travel on this, I suspect Natural England will be coming under political pressure not to do any more for the time being, while government tries to look at how it's going to change the policy and tackle it more effectively. But in the meantime, it has also put in longer term plans, lots of pressure on water companies to clean up the wastewater treatment works. There is equal amounts of pressure going on to farmers to reduce runoff from land, and we will see those two having a longer term effect. So potentially nutrient neutrality, while it's a big issue right now, might not be a big issue always. It's something we have to tackle at the moment. Can the presentation slides be shared? Yes. So Leslie has just downloaded those. Oh, it is Simon. Hi. Yes. Okay. I will email you afterwards with the ecology contacts in your area. So there we go. Andrew, we've got up to 5 minutes left. So if anyone has any more questions or you want to know anything else, do please contact me. Leslie will circulate the slides, or they're there for you to download. And I'm really happy to have follow-up conversations with any of you by email or on the phone. Just drop me a line and we can set up a call. I'm very happy to help you help your clients. I'm here as a specialist in this sector only. I don't want to do valuation work. I don't want to do agency. I don't want to do land management even. I just want to do natural capital consultancy. So I'm no threat to your core business. I could be an asset to you.
That's great.
That's my point. That's done.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Kate. That was brilliant. Really very useful and very informative. So thank you very much. I think the presentation is going to be made available as a video on the CPN website. I think I'll double check that, but the slides are available, as Kate referred to, here. And I think, as I say, the presentation will be available online on the CPN website. So yeah, final thank you to you, Kate, for your time and for your offer to provide us with ongoing advice as when we need it. I'm sure we will be in contact, I've got no doubt. A quick thank you to Leslie Anderson, who sets this all up and runs it all for us, and to Vickery Holman, as usual, for the use of the Demio platform. And just quickly to say, our next CPD session and final CPD session of the year will be on the 6th of December at midday. There'll be an email came around to confirm this, and it will be a presentation about auctions. So there'll be more information to follow, but just a date for your diary for the time being. So on that note, I think final thank you again to Kate, and farewell to everyone, and enjoy your lunch.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.